So, hi Karthik. Thanks so much for joining us on KSAT. Can you share a bit about yourself and a bit about your film, The Sleepwalker Archive?
Hi, I'm a photographer, filmmaker interested in the themes of ecological boundaries that we share with the rest of the natural world. My interest lies in that intersection where the humans and the non human worlds unite and separate. I sort of situate my work in that intersection point. My film Sleepwalker Archives follows a photographer who walks towards the source of the Kaveri River. On his way towards the source, he encounters a woman who cannot be recorded by the camera, and the journey becomes incomplete. And several years later, the photographer encounters a similar story in a photo archive in a coastal town. It revolves around the photographer trying to piece together who this person could be and what this phenomena could be.
So, I was curious actually about your process of research for this. So, if you could tell us a bit about that, because you also refer to Tamil Sangam poetry, you're referring to the archives in Pondicherry. So, there are a lot of different strands that are at work, which we'll also come to in terms of the scripting. But can you tell us a bit about the process itself and how you kind of got into looking at these strands?
So the work actually began when I started photographing the Kaveri River in 2016. It was one of the driest of seasons in a very long time, and the water hadn't reached the sea in few years. And I started photographing at the delta region of the waterless river. And there was a moment I felt I needed to spend more time at the river to be able to sort of engage at a level of more than being a documenter or a photographer, to engage at a very personal level and to sort of somehow establish a contact, establish some sort of a reciprocal relationship if that was possible at all. So I decided that I wanted to walk the entire stretch. So the process of photographing then extended into me walking from the mouth of the river to the source and back. So, which I did in 2018. So, the research, in a way, for me, starts from my experience of walking on the river, along the river, and spending about 2.5 months with the river in every continuous moment. That sort of opened up many questions, gave me many answers. And I came back, and the images remained unopened in a way. Like I shot a lot of images, and the images remained within my drive in the hard drive as my own archive. Several years later, in 2022, I got an IFA grant which gave me access to an archive at Pondicherry, and that archive is situated at French Institute of Pondicherry, and it they primarily hold an archive of the Tamil, not only Tamil, South Indian temples and statues. They've recorded on photographs quite extensively. And the moment I saw the images in the archive, something clicked. I can't put my finger on what exactly like was the connection, but I knew that I had to put this archive and that archive together to sort of weave a story. And the research of that, of working with that archive, actually maybe what I think is the connection is South India. I come from South India. I live in Tamil Nadu. So going to temples is a every weekly ritual, and I've been to many temples as a child. And these images of those sculptures and different gods, goddesses, and other forms sort of is part of my memory in a way. Like it's an archive that I carry. It's a very familiar sort of imagery, and this emptiness of the river and that familiarity sort of gave me gave me a good intersection point to explore something that is sort of invisible in a way. That what I was doing with the Kaveri photographs is I was looking at the surface of the waterless river bed itself to look for traces of water. The question that I came back with is, what is a river? If the river does not flow with water, is it still a river? This was a question that sort of kept brewing within me for a very long time. And once you want to answer that, you have to bring the entire region's cultural landscape into play. The landscape by itself is part of our cultural memory, and the cultural memory also holds these images of stories, of myths that involve the temples and the region around. So my cultural collective memory holds the river and this imagery in a sort of an amalgamation that's inseparable. That way, that's where it started. And the starting point I had was for this film is just that one line of a photographer photographing a woman, but then finds that she cannot be recorded on the camera. The frame is empty. So this is like a predicament that I sort of had as a starting point. And then I followed these two archives. One is my own archive, which was like almost 4 years old, and I hadn't really looked into it. And then this archive that is a public archive, that is a collective sort of archive of the whole South Indian region in a way. So this question I wanted to answer in within these archives on different levels on what is a river. Also, I wanted to answer within this whole question itself. So that's sort of how this research came about. And then parallelly, we are all familiar with many myths from that region, many epics, many commonly orally shared stories, narratives that is very much alive still in the public memory. So that sort of came into, and the structure of putting together this film kind of came from the idea or the act of walking, where my process of walking involved me walking from one place to another for a very long time with what I walked with a friend. And what we decided was to not stay in any hotel. So we have to engage with the river, with the people of the village by the river, and find place. So every day is an unknown in a way. So every step is walking towards an unknown of not knowing where you will end up that day. That's precisely what I sort of applied in the process of the filmmaking itself. Writing was similar. I kept writing, and the editing also. Every frame after frame of edit, I didn't know where it was leading me to. So I just was letting myself be led by the images and by the text that I had, and the memory of my journey along the river, and the memory of my journey along the river as a child, and the memory of all the images that we carry that are older than us itself. So that's largely the process.
I also wanted to reflect a bit on the place of silence in your film. Because there are several points where there's a way in which silence becomes either a beginning or an end. Because I think one of the lines that stayed with me was where the voiceover says, "I would like to respond with silence." And I thought that was really beautiful because there's also another point where the female voice then says, "All that remains now is silence that waits for the return of birds. There is nothing more to be said." So I was wondering, I was a bit curious about that in your film because clearly silence is playing a certain role. And I was wondering if you could reflect on that a little bit.
Technically, scientifically, apparently, there's no silence in the earth. We cannot. So there are soundproof rooms that have been created to look at silence, but even in those rooms, apparently, we tend to listen to our nervous system pumping blood into the entire body. So there is no silence is one stream of thought, and there are people who say there is silence somewhere. So silence is an imaginary, or I start with the idea that silence is an imaginary place. There is no silence for the ear, at least silence as hearing. And silence is also metaphor for something like the opposite that we usually associate with noise or chaos of any kind. So silence is either created by us in some laboratory of some kind. Maybe it's not perfect silence, but they are trying to create. And silence is another metaphor for things that have been silenced, erased, or things that were alive, things that were loud, things that were making noise are not there anymore, and they don't have sound. So it's also there. Actually, if you think about the film, the central poem that I keep repeating in bits and parts, which comes at one point, it alludes towards silence. It refers to silence without talking about silence, actually. So for me, silence is a metaphor at different levels in the film. One is off the river with no water. What is the sound of the river? If you ask anyone, it'll be the water flowing at different decibels, be loud, very quiet, soft of a stream. So there is no imagination of if of the for the question of what is the sound of a river. Maybe there are birds. So for me, when I went to photograph this river, it was a bit confusing that I'm in the river and it's vast and there's no water flowing. And what is the river? So if we ask that same question in terms of an audio experience, what is a river? So how do I answer that with sound as a sense? And how do we answer, bring in different senses in answering this question? Because the journey of walking involves a very sensorial experience more than thinking through. You can't think through, you have to respond with your senses. And film being a medium largely of visuals and sound, so I wanted to have that element of silence as a very strong metaphor that that answers different questions and also remains, that also does not answer some questions. So it's silent in some ways. So it's about that.
So, I mean, this is also an extension of the previous question in a certain way, because I noticed while with your subtitling that whenever the figure is encountered, you don't put subtitles and
Mm.
it's only the voice. So it's also like one thing is that the image isn't able to capture that, but somehow the words aren't either.
Yeah.
So I was kind of curious about that as a choice. I mean, this is just something that I'm a person who is.
Yeah, actually, you've said it. Like image doesn't capture, words doesn't capture either. You can endlessly talk about this person or this phenomena or this apparition in some way, but only by description. It can only emerge in your imagination. And this is the same thing that's in the poem as well. The poem actually, to me, speaks about silence. It talks about different things, but then it leads towards a point of silence. Silence is described in a way through that poem. What is that silence? What caused that silence is what we are left with. That's where the poem becomes haunting in a way. So similarly, for me, I wanted to not have anything there because I wanted it to be in a way not answerable, not describable entirely. So just removed a layer to make it pure experience also of the image. And that's also one thing. I didn't want the subtitle to come in the way. That's a practical choice and another choice also. Yeah.
Yeah, so coming back to the idea of the experience of the film, it's
Mm,
also a long duration film.
mm.
And the challenge that you managed to do is also not like it's you've used still images. So I was also curious about that choice and why you decided to use this language or this form in dealing with these where there is movement within the frame. It's not that the photographs aren't active, but the way in which they proceed from one to the next, reminiscent of still images and progression.
Everybody know about La Jetée, and it is like the first ever film that brings in this form into play. So for me, it was not I was not scared of completely going into the zone because I know that it has been done and it works very well. And what does still I mean what does he Chris Marker do in La Jetée is that he puts that still and he just creates another time. He doesn't locate in any specific time. It's a time, future, past, and the present sort of seamlessly flow. That is something, the quality of a still photograph is open. A still photograph doesn't carry time, it doesn't even carry duration by itself. So when you put on a timeline, it it has a duration, it has a life, it comes and it leaves. So for me, that is the thing where in the film itself, I go across time actually. I go very far in time. I even mentioned that this building was made before the invention of photography itself. So it was a window, a door, a portal. It could be anything for me to allow myself or allow the viewers to enter anywhere, any place, and go into time quite fluidly. So that was one of the main reasons, and I I am trained and I practice as a still image photographer, and I'm very interested in sound. So my earlier work also has images and sound put together into a film. I sort of wanted to extend this by bringing in pieces of narrative and an essay format on weaving in that. It's primarily to be able to travel across time quite frequently is one major reason why I chose this particular form of using still images, and not even like somehow succumbing to the fact of wanting to use a video.
I also thought it was interesting in the way in which you're talking about the multiple histories of photography. Because there's like the family photograph, where all of us probably have some childhood photo, one with siblings, but then you also talk about cyanotype, and that goes back to the larger, the lensless kind of photography. So I was thinking, can you reflect a bit about that and how that's also a part of your film?
There was also this parallel narrative of it's a very end of the day, it's a very personal film for me. What I carry in is something different than what I sort of give away. And my journey as a photographer and my engagement with photography as a medium is something that is answered in these sort of choices, and that's mostly like a very personal sort of choice of my sort of piecing together of what photography's history could be like. For example, cyanotype, why I wanted to bring in this particular context is there is this imageless or unrecordable sort of a figure, right? And what does cyanotype do is it is a form of categorization, but it doesn't reveal the entire plant or the leaf in that case, no? I find it as a very poetic form of record making. My history of photography, or what I feel is history in this particular, within the context of this film, is that the medium of photography was born at a time of immense industrial revolution, at a time when ecology was getting categorized, was heavily tamed, and that was a moment of a big separation that happened between the humans and the non-human world. I see that marking out the birth of photography as an era when we started separating ourselves from the environment around. So photography has this, like photography, if you personify, has this sort of trauma of being in the middle of a separation of humans with the rest of the non-human world. So I come from there as a thing. And cyanotype for me is a categorization that, I mean, that was a time when heavily every plant was starting to get categorized, labeled, and documented quite extensively for the purposes primarily to extract. Not there was of course a learning, scientific learning, pursuit of knowledge was there, but it is not it is complicit in this fact of being used to be able to extract things from ecology. So these recording and these scientific pursuits were actually put to use of different kinds. Same with photography as well. Photography, there was a need to record the image, but there was also the need to record the landscape in a way. So it has a history that we all know about, the colonial history of why photographic landscape imagery were made. So that is one thing I start with, and cyanotype for me is a record making that is poetic in that sense, where you make records. It gives a feeling of the plant. It doesn't give the plant. It gives empty space. It gives white space for people to imagine, to engage in different ways. And the choice of plants that I have used in this film, it comes from a particular Sangam poem. There is a poem, a very long, I think it's probably the longest form. It's called Kurinji Pattu. So it's a love poem where the heroine of the poem is waiting. It's from her perspective. She's waiting for the man to come, and it's in the hill. And while she is waiting, she's a little fidgety and she starts collecting flowers in that region. So, as she starts describing her landscape around, she pauses to describe, and there is a whole sequence of listing 99 flowers. So, the poem has a whole list of 99 flowers while she's waiting for her beloved to come. So, which is documentation, which is record making, which is record of the region, but the context in which it appears is very, what do you call it, where nature and culture sort of intermingles. It's an inseparable mix where my emotions are sort of reflected in the process of color, collecting these flowers, in naming these flowers, in looking at these. So this describe my emotion. So the landscape does not carry an outside, the landscape carries the inside of the person recording. So this is the larger ethos of the Sangam poem itself. And that is why I wanted to bring in cyanotype, where I feel cyanotype is one way of poetic recording of scientific pursuit. And yeah, that's why.